When we learned that Dan Buckley had to go to Tom Brevoort specifically and like, hey, buddy, X-Men is an important franchise. We're about to get X-Men movies. We got Deadpool and Wolverine coming up. This Krakoan era thing did not work out. People are actually really turned off by X-Men right now. The sales are down. Things are not going well. We're going to shit can Jordan White, and we would like to move you over to X-Men. We knew Marvel were going to be taking X-Men a little bit more seriously, and we also knew Tom Brevoort was going to be put in a very, very difficult position. Because while X-Men Krakoan era was not successful in the end, Fall of X sucked. All that kind of stuff. The way it ended was terrible. The status quo for the Krakoan era for the last 3 years, 4 years or whatever has been god-awful. We knew there was going to be tons of pushback, lots of name-calling, lots of suggestions that maybe Tom Brevoort is a bad guy. You're just trying to undo everything because essentially, while for the life of X-Men, it's been a superhero team fighting against evil, and certainly there are lots of undertones or overtones and all kinds of tones of minorities trying to live in a world where everyone hates and fears them and all that kind of stuff. During the Krakoan era, there was an enormous undertone of gay fanfic. That's basically what X-Men became under Jordan White. Queer fanfic, libidical kind of stuff, aimed at an audience that has proven that they don't like to buy comic books. Shockingly, the sales went down and they had to reboot the entire thing. But we knew the 12 psychos on Twitter would be fighting back, and we knew that the shill media would be going along with it and being like, hey, you better not be changing these things that you've done with X-Men. X-Men better be a queer analogy or queer fanfic from now into the future, because you've established under Jordan White that this is what the X-Men are forever and forever, even though if you look at the 60-year history of X-Men, that's not what it's ever been. It's really only been that for a very short period of time. They were not going to go down without a fight, and this week, Tom Brevoort gave them some very bad news about the relationship with Wolverine, Jean Grey, and Cyclops, Wolverine being the meat in the sandwich, the polyamorous type thing. He said it's no more, and this is what he said. According to the X-Men incoming lead editor, the polyamorous relationship between Wolverine, Jean Grey, and Cyclops suggested by the Krakoan era will not carry over into the imminent From the Ashes relaunch. Posting on Substack, editor Tom Brevoort responded to a fan question about whether Jean, Scott, and Logan's relationship status, heavily implied in the Krakoan era, would be left behind with Krakoa. More than just stating that it would be, Brevoort roundly rejected the idea that there was anything of merit to the idea in the first place. Now, I think Tom Brevoort is doing the right thing. If you have bad idea, if you have bad creative, it's best to leave it in the rear view, and it's best to memory dump the really bad ideas. And certainly, Krakoa becoming Orgy Island was a really bad idea. And whether he wants to say it was ever there in the first place, it was certainly heavily implied that there was something going on between Jean Grey and Wolverine and Cyclops. Not only did they have like adjoining rooms on the moon, which was weird. They were the only ones that had doors that connected all the rooms. Put in there for a reason. There were other bits of dialogue that Jonathan Hickman himself had put in there, and I imagine he had done that on purpose. Like he wanted to do something where they were in a three-way, whatever. It was a stupid idea then. It's something that raised the eyebrow. You're like, man, I hope they don't do anything with that. And for the most part, they didn't. They didn't really go along with that. They mostly did that with a lot of other characters because Wolverine is your moneymaker, and you don't want to do things to damage the brand when it comes to Wolverine, but they certainly damage the brand of lots of other characters. And they're acting like Mystique and Destiny are heroes now because they're lesbians, even though they've been lesbians all the time. It's just crazy. And when you read this article, they're very upset that Tom Brevoort, the new group editor of X-Men, would even dare think of removing the fact that Scott and Logan likely have done stuff to each other, while trying to work with Jean, probably in the middle and all that stuff. And it's something that needed to happen. Tom Brevoort, if he's smart, needs to wipe the slate clean. You've got to get rid of the stink of Krakoa off the X-Men. Because if you let it linger there and it never goes away, X-Men can never be a viable, enormous franchise again. You're going to have to go to stuff more like X-Men 97. They're certainly never going to touch any of the stuff touched on in Krakoa in the MCU. You probably want to be creating stories and developing characters that you want to put in movies. They don't want to put anything from Krakoa in the movies because it was such a disaster. Sales died, actual X-Men fans left, and people just pirated the book because that's what that audience does. And this has left a lot of people very upset. They're like, no, you can't go back in time. You can't undo all the stuff from Krakoa, which they're not doing. They're not undoing it. They're just forgetting all the really stupid shit. And when you make mistakes as enormous as Krakoa, sometimes you have to reset. And when you reset, you go back to, as Doc would say, the last known good. What is the last known good for X-Men? It's actually a pretty difficult question. Do you want to go back to the early 2000s? Do you want to go back to the 90s when it was really, really successful? Do you want to go back to the 80s when it became legendary? Do you want to go someplace in the 2010s when it was really falling off the wagon? Like, you've got to find a place that actually works. And what essentially Tom Brevoort has done is try to go back to all three. And that's really the big plan that he's trying to execute, which will not work for David Harth and the other Shield media who say you must stay the Krakoan course even though it failed and you lost money. From the Ashes promises changes that are quite familiar to longtime X-Men fans. These new books have some intriguing setups, but looking at them closely, most are just piggybacking off early X-Men eras from the 90s, double aughts in the 2010s. Big Two comics are exercises in nostalgia and status quo, but From the Ashes should be rather alarming for fans as it reveals Marvel taking a step backward with the X-Men, which isn't always the best way to do things. Certainly, taking a step back is not always the best thing to do. With a character or a franchise or a team and stuff like that, you have to look at what has happened along the way and what is the correct course of action. In the case of X-Men, I don't think you really have any other choice but to step back. It's literally gone off the rails for so long. It's been so devalued by Marvel Comics themselves, starting with when they didn't want to make Marvel X-Men comic books anymore. They're like, we're going to make the Inhumans the X-Men, if that was ever going to work. So they deprioritized the X-Men, and then we get into like the X-Men Colors era, which has really got off. What do you want? Do you want to go back to X-Men Red or X-Men Blue? Nobody wants that kind of stuff. And it has been good for so long. So you really do have to take major steps backwards. And in the case of X-Men, you probably have driven off so many fans, so many lifelong hardcore X-Men fans that were going to their comic book shop every Wednesday to pick up every X-Men book, whether they liked the run or not. They knew it would get better over time. You've likely driven off so many of them that the franchise can't be viable at the scale that they want to produce it, which is like 9 to 12 comic books in a month, without making major step backwards, really driving into nostalgia and trying to remind people why you liked the X-Men in the first place, why you were a Wednesday Warrior, and why you had a complete collection of X-Factor and X-Men and Uncanny X-Men and all these kind of things, and say, hey, listen, we get it. We kind of fucked up here, and we want you to come back. Now, I do believe that is what Tom Brevoort is doing. We're going back to the Outback era. We're going back to the underground X-Men in the sewers and all that kind of stuff. He's certainly trying to play out on all those vibes. But he's also still holding on to Krakoa. It's still a continuation of the Krakoan story. A lot of the new status quo available, at least what we can see in the solicits, for these teams are directly rolling out of Krakoa, which I think is an enormous mistake. They probably should have just went to an 11th life, done something to get themselves out of here to where Krakoa never existed. That would probably be the best way forward for Tom Brevoort and the X-Men office. They chose to go another route, and they're trying to do everything all at once, which is probably going to be the undoing of all this. But the idea that you can't step backward with the X-Men, you have to step backwards with the X-Men as a comic book franchise if you want it to be viable moving forward. It has been damaged to such a degree. The only thing that probably can make it work is nostalgia at this point, but these guys don't realize how bad Krakoa was. When Dan Buckley actually has to go to the office and sit Tom Brevoort down to take the job, that tells you something really fucked up happened. The dude had literally been on Avengers for 30 years straight? They realized something bad happened. Now, in the end, they didn't actually go out and get talent for this From the Ashes reboot, which is probably going to be the ultimate undoing, but we will certainly be hearing from the David Harts and the other people out there that we need Krakoa back, even though it was roundly rejected by everybody. The Krakoa era was a breath of fresh air for many reasons, which is why it succeeded so well initially. From the Ashes is anything but. The best example is the X-Men portion of the Blood Hunt Uncanny X-Men Free Comic Book Day issue. The story focused on Jubilee trying to sneak back to the X-Mansion, which had been made into a prison for the mysterious Prisoner X and other mutants. The story takes readers into the mansion to introduce them to the jail keepers of the mutants, and ends with Jubilee fighting some bigots at a diner and then agreeing to join the X-Men. It's certainly, the Krakoan era was very successful initially with House of X Powers of 10, and then it completely lost its luster, and it hasn't been anything to really get excited about since. And I think that's what they don't realize, is that while Jonathan Hickman very skillfully crafted out a new status quo that was exciting, and I roundly reject this idea that old comic book fans just don't like change. I'm an old comic book fan, and from everything that I heard from comic book retailers, a lot of the people that were coming in to buy House of X Powers of 10 were old X-Men fans that were returning because they were excited, because it sounded like there was good change in X-Men. It sounded like they were embracing the change. It's unfortunate that after Dawn of X and you get into Pterosaurs and you're like, whoa, this is not going to go anywhere that I actually wanted. And obviously Jonathan Hickman agreed. He's like, I know I started this and I had my 3-year plan and I knew exactly what I wanted to do. But at this point, I'm going to have to step away because you guys have fucked up my idea so to such a degree that it's not really even salvageable anymore. So I'm going to have to leave and you guys keep fucking up everything I created. And that's basically what happened. They brought in the Legion of Doofuses, the worst collection of writing talent in the history of comic books, at Marvel or DC, certainly. They put them into one office and they said, what bad can you do? How many bad stories can you write? And they took our breath away with just how bad the X-Men got in the Krakoan era. It was initially successful because it was good change, that was exciting, that X-Men fans actually bought into. But once X-Men fans no longer bought into it and they realized this sucks, it's just gay fanfic, it's just Orgy Island. This is not the status quo I was promised. They're not going to pay off these things the way they should. This is actually Magneto's dream. The X-Men turned into the villains, and they walked away. There went the sales, there went the interest, and there went the viability of the franchise as it was at that moment. And that's why we got to this point. But they're always like, whoa, the Krakoan era was a breath of fresh air. Yeah, sure it was. Until it got bad, and then it got worse, and then it somehow got worse. I didn't imagine that Kieran Gillen could actually finish up the Krakoan era with Rise of the Powers of 10 being that terrible. Jerry Duggan's Fall of the House of 10, or Fall of the House of X, which was bad, was somehow better than Rise of the Powers of 10. That's how bad things got. It ended with an enormous flop. They need to move on past this. This is the last thing that David Harth said. Nostalgia is a big part of the big two superhero comics. Everything always reverts to the status quo to attract new readers. The rationale is new fans know the basics, so returning things to the basics will make it easier for them to get into the books. However, this ignores decades of people walking up to spinner racks in grocery stores and gas stations, picking up random issues and becoming fans. All right, dumbass. So the status quo is whatever the status quo that has been established within the comic books. You don't revert back to the status quo. You were in the status quo. You revert back to a different status quo, potentially, and you want to reestablish that. It's not because it's a better jumping on point, because when you're just copying stuff that's already happened, the copy is almost never as good as the original. You know, you still have that stuff to be jumping on points. The reason they're actually doing it is because they understand and they've acknowledged that the X-Men comic books are in such bad state, it cannot continue on the way it is and be feasible. It's not going to work that way. And you have to revert to the last time it actually kind of worked. Unfortunately for Tom Brevoort, he was not part of X-Men. I don't think he likes X-Men. So he didn't know where to go back to. You know, and I wouldn't even know where to go back to. I wouldn't want to go back to Grant Morrison's new X-Men. I thought it sucked. I would probably go back to the 90s. But everybody says the 90s had bad stories and good art. I would probably go back to them where they were selling 7 million copies of fucking X-Men 1, you know, and millions of copies of different, you know, franchises within X-Men all at the same time. I would go back to there if I wanted to revert to a previously known good state. So they're going back to 3 or 4 previously known good states and trying to make it happen, and hopefully, hoping about beyond hope that X-Men fans will actually return to support the franchise. But at this point, I think they've burned those bridges too many times. I think most X-Men fans that want to read the comic books realize this isn't the reboot for me. This isn't the franchise for me anymore. You've got 17 years of Claremont. You've got 30, 40 years of awesome X-Men stuff to go and explore. If you haven't gone through all that yet, that's great stuff right there. If you've already gone through it, go back again. 30 or 40 years of continuity is a lot of stuff to remember. You're probably going to see stuff that you forgot about the first time and remember how great it was completely in comparison to the Krakoan era. But it's got to still be gay fanfic. I think this is why these guys are all freaking out. You can't go back to the mansion when people like the book. You can't go back to the Meta Strike Team when people bought the book. They got to stay queer, man. And this is the big backlash. Will Tom Brevoort have the testicular fortitude to listen to the 12 Psychos on Twitter and not be moved by it? Will Tom Brevoort have the testicular fortitude to hear the show media saying, you have to go back to Krakoa, that was the greatest thing ever, we got new fans? Yeah, you got a dozen of them. Unfortunately, you drove off 40,000 fans in the process. Does he have the balls to go, you know what, you guys are idiots. You don't know what's going on here. You don't know how bad it got, and you don't realize how many people we drove off. Tom Brevoort literally could not hire anybody with name value to work on X-Men. That's how badly they devalued the franchise at this point. It might be beyond saving, but it certainly couldn't continue down being gay fanfic. It could not continue down being weird Wolverine, Jean Grey, Cyclops, thruple stuff, and Somnus the Rape Sleeper and all that kind of shit that was going on and very prevalent throughout the Krakoan era and all the Legion of Doofuses. Do I think he'll nail it? Absolutely not. But I think at least he's trying, and you got to try something. If you like more conversations about X-Men, Marvel Comics, DC Comics, any kind of comic books, this is the place to be. Specifically, if you like what we're doing here, you can go and support us on Patreon, and we've got lots of bonus content in the form of podcasts, like 32 hours a month at least. There's a link in the video description if you would like to support us on Patreon.